Right, well, good morning, comrades, and welcome back to Athens for those who do not hail from the capital. Now, the title of today's panel is Collective Struggles and Individual Liberties, or Freedoms, if you prefer. Now, strangely enough, oddly enough, I'd say, there are still collective struggles, although a large part of the organized political formations of the left are not actually aware of it, have not caught wind of that. And in this very difficult Europe, couple of days before the European elections, we can see that on the one hand we have the bleakness that becomes denser, and on the other hand we have several things happening that are very difficult to perceive because they're not very well formed or organized, but are hopeful or appear to be hopeful. We always need to be a bit reserved. Now, from the yellow jackets, gilets jaunes of France, and the students who took to the streets in many areas to actually protest for the situation, the climate and the world, we see grandiose protestations in Salvini's Milan in favor of the refugees, and grandiose protests in Chemnitz in Germany, the bleakest bleakness that we have against racism. Now, such things actually happen. Something is moving about. It is our job as the left to listen in to what is actually happening and not to be too pessimistic. Now, today, our MEP Stelios Kouloglou was also invited to participate in this panel before presenting the two lovely ladies who just left because he had a plane to catch, and he humbly apologizes for that. Today we have with us Tasia Christodoulopoulou, Vice Speaker of the House, Anneta. She's an Syriza MP in Athens, and the process I have actually decided is to have the two ladies take the floor, to have anyone from the audience to say whatever they want, and then we will go out and enjoy the sun. Right, who goes first? Anneta, you have the floor.
Good morning. When I was invited to today's panel and when I saw the name of the moderator, I thought, well, this is a reporter, so I should prepare a really good document, a good presentation, and I would like to share with you some of my thoughts. So, collective struggles and personal freedoms. When we talk about fundamental human rights and freedoms in Europe, we must have some things clearly defined in our mind and in our political life. First of all, we must agree that rights and freedoms are not a concession, but something that the European peoples have achieved. They were not granted by a leader, but they are part and they emerged from bloody revolutions throughout history, in 1848, and the labor movement after the Industrial Revolution, and the socialist and Marxist ideas. And in the 20th century, we had the suffragettes, the emancipation and equality movements for women, the feminist movement, the movement for the LGBT rights, and May 68 in France. So today we are talking about a European culture that guarantees exactly these rights and freedoms. And the second thing we must keep in mind is that when we talk about rights and freedoms, do we all mean the same? And for the left, it goes without saying that in the Europe that we want, all rights are equally protected without discrimination. So there are no first or second class rights. What we want is that all people enjoy, without limitations, all their economic, social, environmental rights that are interlinked with the concept of a progressive community and society. So everyone should enjoy those rights equally. This is a holistic concept about the state of law, the justice, and the protection of fundamental rights that rejects the distinction between personal, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. And it recognizes that all rights under all categories are equally important in a modern society, and they must enjoy the same protection under the law. It has already been proven that there is a close link between fundamental rights, both collective and personal, and it was also proven during the big economic crisis of the 21st century that we are still experiencing. Now, I would like to refer to a third point that is very important for me, in my view. Throughout Europe, there is a significant reduction of the protection of social and political rights, and there is a limitation of rights under neoliberalism and a limitation of political rights, personal rights and freedoms, and an increase of the oppression of the state, because under normal legal conditions there would be no opportunity to implement the programs and the ideas of neoliberalism. How would it be possible to implement the deregulation of the European social model, the abolishment of the welfare state, the privatization of social goods and the public sphere? This is all imposed by neoliberalism. In order to do so, neoliberalism created an extreme crisis that actually limited the possibility of citizens to react. And we have seen this in various countries. Focusing on security, states actually limit the rights of citizens to protest, and any opposing opinions are being criticized, and the struggles and the defense of society against this situation is violently oppressed. Therefore, the liberalization of economy, the reforms of the neoliberalism regimes actually lead to the limitation of political rights, traditional rights that used to be taken for granted and were achievements of the European culture, like the right to a fair trial, are actually limited. There are some emergency measures that are adopted under the pretext of terrorism that are actually being become regular, legal, and actually exist for indefinitely. So there is a limitation of other rights that have to do with the free development of a personality and the self-determination of the person. And this has to do with personal liberties or the sexual, gender-based rights of women and the LGBT community. And these are just some examples. The very brave legislative initiatives that have been taken by the government in those sectors are not a result of a European trend. Similar initiatives in other countries like Portugal are actually small steps within a very conservative Europe. And what is the conclusion? That neoliberalism is harming not only social cohesion and social rights, but also personal rights, political and democratic liberties, and the state of law, the rule of law, excuse me. So the need to protect human rights has been highlighted by the Council of Europe. So in the Council of Europe, we have highlighted the risk for a general crisis when it comes to European institutions and the European Convention on Human Rights. So if we have a single European culture, this Charter of Fundamental Human Rights should be its basis, its cornerstone, because it protects basic freedoms in the European Union, and combined with the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, actually protects the fundamental principles that we should keep protecting. So both the European Union and the Council of Europe are being pressured today. And this could lead to a very difficult future for Europe. The next point I would like to highlight is the following. What should be the answer of the European left to the new challenges for collective and personal rights in Europe? In my view, we should try to achieve a holistic perception that agrees with left principles when it comes to personal and human rights. The respect to political and personal rights is a requirement for collective struggles and achievements. And at the same time, the only way to achieve justice for all and respect for political and personal rights would be to eliminate the conditions that bring about arbitrary behaviors and this kind of situation that leads to individualism vis-à-vis collective action, dogmatism, and other causes that have brought about the emergence of fascism in Europe. Unfortunately, no legislation by itself is enough in order to address these conditions, because human rights and justice are not just legal provisions. They have to do with education and way of living. They are not just limited in the public sphere, but they are part of society in its everyday life. Without doubt, the rise of the far right in Europe is linked to the dismantling of the rule of law. Fascism is the last step, the final product of neoliberalism. But let's go back to the answer that must be given by the European left. A first step is to redetermine and protect social goods such as transport, education, energy, water, natural resources, health. I'm talking about public goods like information, culture, and in the sense there are strict limitations. There must be strict limitations when it comes to the profitable exploitation of these fields, and we must create the conditions for their democratic use and exploitation. I mentioned previously the issue of information, so allow me to focus more on this due to my professional capacity. I'm a reporter, as you might know. So information is a public good, and there is no doubt about it. There should be no doubt about it. So information is focused on free dialogue and an open debate and dialogue that is necessary in order to form complete citizens. However, there is a question that arises quite often, and is the following. Is the current situation of the private media in Europe in line with this ideal? In many cases, we are seeing cruel attacks full of hatred rhetorics, sexism, racism. And in New Zealand, in the past 2 days, we have seen that there has been an effort of the media to present the perpetrator as someone who is just a psychopath. Of course, people who have psychological, who are mentally ill, are usually targeted by the media. But the truth is that this person is a white, racist, Nazi killer. So it's not just a person that has psychological or mental issues that have to be treated. So the role of the media is very important there, because they actually communicate to collective consciousness that this is just a sick person and there's nothing to do about it. And this is the best way to absolve this kind of behavior. Of course, we must react towards this hatred that is transmitted by many members of the media. We must address this misinformation, the fake news, because they are actually trying to distort the freedom of press, speech and expression, concepts that are the cornerstones of democracy and we must protect. So the European project of the 21st century needs new foundations. The Europe of the future must be a society of values and rules, principles that are European because they emerge from revolutions and the European Enlightenment. However, they should be called universal or global principles and ideas. The ideas that were born in Europe should be the cornerstone of the European project, despite the fact that they are not respected by the most part of our planet today. So if Europe wants to make a difference, and if it wants to answer the question about what it is and what it symbolizes, the answer is there. The heart of Europe lies in the respect of the rights that actually express humanitarian principles and not the liberalization of markets or fiscal discipline, transparency and accountability, or promoting the economic interests of the financial oligarchs. There is no future for Europe in all that. So, and I will conclude here, the European left must struggle for a different Europe, a Europe that inspires citizens, that is contrary to racism, xenophobia, discriminations and any form of political and religious dogmatism that keep people trapped and make them become the puppets of tyrants. So all this might sound like a dream, but it's something that can be put into practice and should be the goal of an open society. The European democracy and identity crisis has proven that we cannot take anything for granted and no rights should be taken for granted. That justice and democracy require a continuous struggle in order to be maintained. So in the Europe that we imagine, the law protects the weak and are not used by the strong and by the powerful in order to oppress the weak. Europe is here and the state is here to protect equality, solidarity and justice for all with no discriminations. And the goal is to guarantee the right to a free development of everyone's personality and that people can develop and can grow in their own way. European Union today is actually contrary to the concept of European integration. The fundamental rights, values and principles of this European integration are the main principles of Europe, and this could make citizens have a positive approach to European Union, to the European Union. If the European Union ceases to be an example of freedom for its peoples, what is left for it? I will close here. Thank you very much, Anneta.
Thank you very much, Anneta Kavvadia. It's a very big thing when politicians end their presentations with a question mark. Now, what we need the politicians to do is to give answers. I'm joking, obviously, so I'll give the floor now to the next speaker, our good friend, comrade Tasia Christodoulopoulou. Now, I would say that, well, there's just a handful of us here, so let's just cut to the chase and say that right now the European Union is a riddle. It's a riddle that has to do with what it wants, what it can do, and what its future is. Now, I believe that we can still already rather see the early signs and we need to evaluate them. One of those signs is that the European Union did not manage to satisfy the needs of European societies. That austerity and the neoliberal model of financial and economic policy is what caused the victimization of the unemployed, the marginalized, the people in the fringe, the people who have no social identity, and therefore it's easy for the far-right ideology to take the lead. Now, it exactly answers this very fact, which is that people no longer have social identities, and therefore their last refuge is the national identity. It's to be French, to be German, to be whatever they are, and then to have the European ideal and European unity fade out. Now, this is a very timely issue, and it's of the essence, and I don't think that we've discussed this in Greece either, because every Greece and every capitalist social formation is seeking for those ways that will allow it to replicate, to reproduce. Now, we saw Brexit. We saw that a country, a large capitalist country, considered, well, in principle, those who were the hegemonic classes of the Great Britain, those were the ones who actually stood behind that, is that they thought that it would be best for them to be outside the European Union. Now we can see the problems and the ripples this has created, both in the political system and society, that in the beginning seemed to be, well, very feisty and very strong in favor of them being removed from the European Union. At the same time, we see far-right parties on the rise, exactly because they promise a return to nation states. So we are at a very critical point, a very critical crossroads. It's the point at which there is an attempt for unification and merger of neoliberalism with the far-right ideology. And this is something that's already happening in America. In America, Trump's policy, which is a far-right policy overall, with the changes he's making in the trafficking of goods, of trades, of wares and services, the country is being led to the adoption of protective measures that will give the signal to societies and the financial power centers that maybe we should try returning to nation states. So the things are quite difficult, comrades, and if it's only the left that says that European Union is a field for class struggle, or it can be a field where we can have memories and reminisce about very important things that happened in Europe and made people happy and safe, then this, I must say, is not enough. What does not suffice either is to simply criticize the architecture of the European construct. The fact that bodies and agencies without democratic legitimization are deciding about the fates of people without asking the people first. It is through that, and with the confusion that we have in the domestic policies of the nation states, where no one knows what will happen at any given time and whether those who implement European policies actually believe in them, so they can, as a matter of fact, say that they don't believe in them so as to have an alibi vis-à-vis the people on whom they impose it. But on the other hand, we can never understand exactly how this political competition is carried out inside the countries vis-à-vis Europe and our relationship with Europe. So I believe that we're faced with critical issues and critical questions to which we have not answered, and it's a very serious thing that the European elections that will be held in 2 months' time will actually define the European landscape of the next 5 years. Now, the political correlation that will emerge rather in these elections will be the one to handle and manage those stakes, those issues about which society still doesn't have any precise answers. And I believe that this is an issue that forces us to raise questions, even if we don't have the answers to them. Because, well, many a time raising a question or asking a question is probably better, because this allows people to think, to ponder, to question themselves, and to say that it would be very tragic after the collapse to adopt new certainties. Certainties collapsed together with communism. Because we need to find new bases on which we will found the lives of the left, of the working class, and so on and so forth. So the landscape is grey, is grim. Austerity is the dominant policy all over Europe. Alongside the dissolution of the social welfare state, by that I mean the elementary means that each citizen had at their disposal to feel that they will not be left to die in the streets or to live on a bench outside somewhere. They will have the possibility to enjoy fundamental rudimentary dignity, everything that was an acquis after the war, through the social contracts. All these things are no more. Alongside that, in this landscape, we see fear and insecurity emerging. And, you know, fear is the most invincible emotion people can feel. It is inconquerable because it is irrational. And in order for one to manage it, one must have hope. This is how I believe that the far right, the extreme right, manages to win. It's through fear, and this is something we need to analyze. We need to propose new things for people and societies to disentangle themselves from fear. Whatever happens is utilized through fear, and at the same time it is enhanced by the mass media. The mass media are irrational. They use mottos, and they address to the individual who is a couch potato. Now they have the strength to influence them deeply, and what they receive from their everyday life to see as a generalized concept and to adopt it as such in the same way. At this point, we could say that in this bleak and grim landscape of austerity and of dissolution of the social state, there is the financial crisis, in other words, which apparently is here to stay. And of course, in each and every country, it appears under different guise. We have the Greece of memoranda, which is quite different than Macron's France or England that is seeking a new way forward. But these are the common points: austerity and dissolution of the social state. It is on this ground, in 2015, we found refugees and immigrants, those desperate people who in the vast majority come from a war, and they were seeking a safe refuge, a safe haven for them and their families to live in. Now, since this taboo existed in Europe, that they had the social culture and it had conventions that shield and protect everyone against anything that might arise, no one actually dared in those first phases and say that the refugees are persona non grata. The Geneva Convention was another taboo. So everyone, albeit hypocritically, welcomed them, considering that this way they would serve the rudimentary legitimacy that is provided for by international conventions and laws. This, however, very soon changed. It changed through the same governments who found the people who were willing to close down the frontiers and the borders, those willing to speak in a way that is less than good for those refugees, and they described them as enemies of the working class, as enemies of the European way of living, enemies because they believe in a religion that is dangerous and probably insinuates crime or promotes it, and enemies because they have a different culture. Now, all this created, and you will see this even more clearly, that changed in 2016 on November the 13th, when the Bataclan attack took place. That, I believe, was the most crucial, critical moment in European history. As soon as it was revealed that the perpetrators were, well, in this case it was a demystification, they were second-generation immigrants who had lived in the country, they had studied in the country, they had loved in the country. And still they perpetrated this atrocious crime. That is when this whole democratic principle construct started crumbling. The first thing France did was to declare a martial state. It was a dictatorship in a sense, because it was special martial law which rescinded all rights and freedoms, so that they would be able to apprehend, to interrogate people and to make its suppressive mechanisms more effective. No one complained. No one reacted. There was absolutely no reaction en masse, including the left. And that is the starting point from which the cultivation of this limitless fear, that fear, attack, the other culture, are those responsible for our bad fortune. The left back then, although it could have led a campaign saying that these people did not uproot themselves from their countries to come to these states to become criminals, since most of them were second-generation immigrants, instead of saying that we're in no danger from the weak, societies are in danger from the strong, who claim their constant expansion and increase in growth, instead of the left saying that in this Europe many people can actually find a job, provided that the capitalists are willing to reduce their profit. They said absolutely nothing. So in the left there was a very weird sense. There was a very strange situation, and from what I could see, the left seems to think it's a taboo to speak in an aggressive way about the immigration and the refugee problem, and I believe that this is a tremendous defeat for the left of tomorrow. It's something that Kaki mentioned earlier, that in Italy every now and then 200,000 people in various people are gathering and are protesting against the Salvini refugee policy. That is to say, against Salvini's decision to close down its ports and exclude refugees and immigrants through the well-known ships and floating devices either from Libya or elsewhere. This, comrades, has created in Italian society two societies. The one that is phobic, feels fear, and is expressed by the Salvini measures, which is why they voted for him, and another part of society that actually realizes and understands that you can have neither democracy, nor solidarity, nor dignity when you condemn the people who are persecuted to drowning. Because that's what they do, comrades. They leave them for hours on end, and there is an endless discussion in Europe as to which country will actually receive the boat. Did this happen by accident? No, it did not. In 2015, even Merkel, who was supposedly an illuminated person of the upper classes of Germany, said they're welcome to come here because I can assimilate them and integrate them. And as a matter of fact, there were some industrialist associations who actually agreed with her. This thing, at that point in time, became a weapon in the hands of the extreme right and the turn of Merkel's party towards the extreme right, but also to the increase of the impact and influence of the extreme right in Germany. It strikes me as very odd that they were able to utilize, I'm talking about the extreme right, the refugee and the immigrant issue to rise and gain more audience in the liberal, the progressive audiences. Now, I believe that this is an issue that we need to look into any further. Why did the extreme right stand to gain rather than the left? Do we have an answer for that? We need to answer that. Because, well, in conditions of poverty, this is what they said in the past, those were the myths. Of course, they were, of course, refuted later, and especially with the French May, that was a revolt against a society of abundance. But this is what we said, that the more poor, the more oppressed, the more undignified the people are, the more they develop radical practices, revolts, and they seek to have more. This is not something we saw in this case. What we saw is that the left did not utilize the systemic gap that was created from the systemic far right and neoliberalism and so on and so forth. The left did not cover this gap. It was the extreme right that did so, and this was the great defeat of Europe. Now, the risk is still there for the situation to become even worse. So this must be the spear point behind which we will go to the European elections and onwards. Because at the moment, you can't simply be disdainful for Europe and to just avoid talking about the far right, the refugees, the dissolution of the social state and austerity. You can't. Those who try to talk about Europe that must be more democratic, that must listen to the citizens, all this wishful thinking that becomes political program, because this is where we ended up with, is to have our wishful thinking turned into a political program. It's not even targets or aims, because targets require a strategy to be approached. This is what we need to see, comrades, in order to be able to say that we're at a defensive phase, to be able to deter the integration between neoliberalism and the extreme right. And this is very important. And since it's important, this is why we're looking at political alliances under a different light. To bring me to a second subject, a second issue of these times. It's not as though Syriza just woke up one day, or the parts of the Social Democrats, and wonder about the neoliberal policies that were implemented in other countries alongside the right, or that they tolerated these policies in other countries without speaking a word, and today they're seeking new roads ahead. So to these people and to the people who influence these parties, it's very important to have the left with a political proposal. A political proposal that will be not only another way of managing this crisis, but first and foremost a way that will allow people to become hopeful again, because that's the turning point. At the moment, we have the menace of a black Europe, the threat of a black Europe. We need to respond to these threats in a tangible way. And of course, the yellow jackets, regardless of who will exploit them politically or take credit for them politically, we can see that Le Pen's party is first in the polls. So this is a very contradiction within the society. So in the polls, it appears that in the European elections, Le Pen will take the lead, and at the same time, for 3 months, every Saturday, thousands of people in different parts of France take to the streets and claim their right to be heard first, and to satisfy their needs second. So it's these issues that we need to promote. We don't need to feel embarrassed about the yellow jackets, because I mean they were there in the squares. In the upper square we had Golden Dawn. I mean this doesn't mean that we would have to destroy the squares and destroy these movements and the awakening of parts of society who in the time of memoranda was fearful of the future. We need to be emancipated overall. We need to see things for what they are. We need to see the contradictions for what they are. And we need to see that by simply speaking against neoliberalism, as though it were something that people are aware of perfectly, and they're not. They don't know what neoliberalism is all about. Neoliberalism is a financial system of capitalism management at this point. Now, we discussed this with Petros. We're not talking about capitalism anymore, thinking that and it's more appropriate, as it were, to talk about neoliberalism. There is an issue, you know, to understand where we're living in. Now, to quote Marx, philosophers explain the world. Communists, left-wing people, the radicals, need to change it. So here we're trying to bring the two together, to say what's happening, why it's happening, and at the same time how to change it. The political task for the left is great. I mean, we were happy to live in a country that lived under a different model, that was the opposite from Europe, that not only welcomed refugees, not only, according to some measurements, 500,000 people, one way or another, were involved in the reception and the living of refugees for as long as they were living here, with this huge movement of solidarity, but also with the fact that the left was voted the first party. We were an exception. This is not something that should bring us satisfaction. Now, we said that socialism cannot happen overnight. Neither can democracy in a country. Neither does tolerance, having rights, having these policies that shield the dignity of the citizens in the country. When you have a Europe that is living the total irrationalism, and they're not giving us the 1 billion euro, which is our money. It's not their money, it's our money. They're withholding it and they're not giving us our money because we do not follow the program to an iota and we don't meet the deadlines. Is it possible in such a framework to convince Europe and convince people that such a Europe is worth fighting for? It's worth supporting? We need to go back to square one. Now, I don't know whether this speech sounds a bit opposing the government, because the last thing I would like to do is spread pessimism. But the way we're doing, the way we see, is that society needs ways to change, and we must be a part of this procedure, and we must seek the ways in which both in Greece and in Europe will open some cracks, will allow some channels to open, so that the claim of the societies for social state, for abolishment of austerity, for abolishing war, abolishing poverty all over the world, will be true. And we owe to everyone. Do you remember in the past, when we were left in the past, we were trying to eradicate the debt of the third world, and now there's not a single country that's not in debt. Everyone is in debt. They're using this, of course, in order to cultivate and promote these emergency situations, and in the name of those emergency situations, they create needs for us. They put us in need. And at the same time, we have policies of exception. Exception from rights, from conquests, exception from everything. So, and I would like to conclude, I believe that European elections, one way or another, regardless of whether we hear this all over Europe or in some places, the people have started thinking. And we must reveal, and there's a book that's excellent, written by Comrade Kouloglou, that says what the extreme right decided in the European Parliament regarding all issues that had to do with the working hours, with the working conditions, with the increases, with everything, so that society will finally realize that the extreme right is as repulsive as Nazism. Nazism after the war was highlighted as the greatest crime against humanity, and today they are giggling at it and they're admiring it in a covert way, and there is a risk of it merging with neoliberalism at this stage of the neoliberalism's crisis. These are the stakes, comrades. And I believe that we must become heralds of what we lived, because what we lived was unique. And apart from the compromise we had to do, apart from the pressures we were under from Europe back in 2015, that was without feelings, I believe that these things have led us, alongside with the Syriza policy, to avoid seeing the extreme right being on the rise in Greece. And this is a great bet, this is a large bet, to be the exception once again. And we will be the exception, comrades, because the extreme right in Greece traditionally does not surpass 5%. The additional 3%, and Golden Dawn reached 7.5 or 8%, is this new trend of the instinct of death of people, the secret admiration of violence, because we believe that they are the carriers of violence. Because violence is all over the place in our everyday life, so it attracts people, it attracts young people, it attracts people who don't feel they belong somewhere, and the extreme right makes them feel like they do. So we must become once again heralds of those ideas, because we compromised, but at the same time we avoided this downfall of society that would lead to Golden Dawn. This was the great success of Syriza, and it is for this success that I do not take back any compromise we did, for any retreat we have regarding our ideals, because if we hadn't, this country would have been Italy. This is how we would have been living, and we must never forget this in order to understand the interconnection between the economic and social policy with the visions, the ideas and the rights. It is this darkness of Europe that is the actual threat. Well, I'm on a roll now because I'm talking about refugees. Now, when Europe on its own allowed each and every Orban to say that I don't agree with the quota, now we who disagreed with the economic policy were almost waged war against. Now, they didn't agree with the refugee issue, they didn't want the refugees, and Europe was looking at them and said, oh, right, well, they don't want refugees, so what can we do about that? That's the issue, comrades. This is why the refugee issue is emblematic. We shouldn't say that in the name of votes we should not promote this issue. We shouldn't do that for fear of nationalism, or because Macedonia or something like that does not bring in the votes. We will have the people's vote because the people recognize that this is conducive to democracy. It's conducive to a new society of the many, or a Europe for the many, to quote the slogan behind me. Thank you very much indeed.
So after Tasia Christodoulopoulous presentation, we will now open the floor for questions. And those of you who want to ask questions, please come here to the microphone, because this event is live streaming.
Όχι. Όχι.
Live streaming means that all questions must be asked using the microphone, regardless of whether you are speaking loudly or not, because the sound will never reach the live streaming. You can come here if you want. I will be very brief. I believe that the rise of the far right, both in Europe and in other continents, has to do with an issue that has not been mentioned as much as it should. And it is the question that the far right, both in Greece and elsewhere, transmitted the false message that democracies are linked to scandals, whereas dictatorships, because this is what they want to bring about, are violent but honest. We know very well that in Greece and elsewhere, dictatorships have always been linked with scandals and uncontrolled corruption. That was all. Thank you very much. Starting from the first presentation by Anneta, I would like to say that rights, since their first establishment, were inalienable and undivided. So they concern everyone on the one hand, and on the other hand, they cannot be divided. And sometimes in practice we see that the opposite is actually happening. In Samos, on the island of Samos, we say that refugee children should not go to school because they have not been vaccinated. So we are actually depriving them of their right to health. At the same time, using this as a pretext, they are also deprived of their right to education. On the contrary, both rights should have been covered and protected. On the other hand, we can talk about an evaluation of rights. And as the poet said, well, I never thought that life would be the most important among things. So, of course, making an evaluation and classification of rights sometimes can be done. And the right to education is fundamental because it allows children not only to listen, but also to experience, when they are at school, a different world, a world that is based on rights, and something that they do not often see outside in the real world. So education is a significant part for building a new society in the Europe of the future. Now, about the second presentation, and with regard to human rights, I would like to mention that rights are part of a process that has to do with the level of power, of the exercise of power. So we have power that is either at the national level or at the local level. It has to do with the scale of power exercise. So locally, priest might believe that he's not insulting anyone when he speaks about the LGBT community in a negative way. And on the other hand, at the European level, we have the European Court stipulating that he has actually violated the rights of people. So at the European level, we are using the economic policy in order to dismantle the welfare state and actually to eliminate fundamental rights. And on the other hand, at the national level, the Greek economic policy is not being supported, despite the fact that it wants to reinforce the welfare state. So we see that there is a change in the scale of decision making. In this way, rights are being compromised in one of the two levels, the European or the local, according to the examples we mentioned. And this is a significant part of European policies. And as correctly highlighted by the second speaker, what is happening in Europe is decisive for us, because European policies determine the type of welfare state, balances within the welfare state, and priorities. Can I continue on that? Good morning. Thank you. I would like to personally thank you for your presentations. At some point, I thought that this is an issue that has to do with women. My name is Sofia Didzikou. I am a member of Syriza, and I have different hats, different capacities, as many of us do here. And I'm active in many different sectors. And the common denominator is protecting human rights for vulnerable population groups. And let me state here, based on what Anneta said, that human rights are legally binding. We have a distinguished jurist here. She can confirm that. We're not talking about a choice. It is an obligation. And of course it has to do with knowledge, with education, with the willingness of the system to apply them. But this is not a choice. We cannot opt for respecting human rights. We are obliged to do it. And otherwise, sanctions should be imposed. And of course, this should be the ideal situation. This is one part, and this is something that we must have in mind. The second question is, what kind of Europe do we want? About whether the Europe we see today, the image we are seeing and the image we are giving to others is actually what was promised at first, and that the people, the citizens, had in mind and in their heart. The Europe of citizens, the Europe of societies, of rights. This is something that is being destroyed very rapidly, and sometimes it has destructive effects for everyone. The refugee crisis has arrived, in my view, in order to show us our deficiencies at the European level. Decision makers and decision-making centers, both national and European, did not want to take action, and therefore societies had to bear the burden. And you have seen in our country that there was a wave of solidarity by society, and it actually revealed the indifference, the violation of all human rights at the European level. At least in Greece, I agree with you that in these elections we must use the refugee crisis as part of our rhetoric. We should not be called to give explanations about the refugee crisis, but we should ask for explanations by others, because there are many questions arising from the refugee crisis, and I have experienced this in my everyday life and at the European level, from European movements, for example, about health. This started with a question about what kind of healthcare we want in Europe, because when people are poor and have no access to healthcare, this leads to complete impoverishment of people. What is the position of women in those cases? What is our position at the European level when rights are being violated? I would like to see more action when it comes to what happened with the lawyer from Iran who was convicted to 38 years of imprisonment and a very hard punishment for defending the fundamental rights of women. All this actually brings about the question about where Europe is going, and this is also a way for us to mobilize ourselves. And I will conclude here. Our role and our responsibility is to mobilize societies that have already started to be more active through movements everywhere. For example, the European movement for healthcare that has now received a global dimensions or an activist level. So we should listen to what they are saying, to what politicians are saying, and we should pass from theory to practice and to action. And as the comrade said, there is an unquestionable right to life, and it should not be compromised. And of course, the right to healthcare, the right to education, all these rights should be an obligation and should be taken for granted and should be something that we all enjoy. Thank you. Please give the microphone to the lady here. Thank you very much. I would like to inform you, and I would like us to organize our actions for a very important issue that happened in Strasbourg during the plenary session. It was asked from Antonio Tajani to resign, because in the previous day he had made statement in favor of Mussolini, reproducing the discourse of the far right since the end of the Second World War. Mr. Tajani, the President of the European Parliament, is member of the party Forza Italia of Berlusconi, and quite often he has expressed his admiration for Mussolini. This is insulting, actually, the Italian people and the democratic Europe. Leonora Florenza requested to speak. They didn't let her finish. However, she said that a study had been carried out in Italy, and it found that a few years ago, when Tajani expressed his opinion in favor of fascism, there was an increase of popular support to far-right parties. Almost all political groups in the parliament, with the exception of the central right and the far right, condemned the declarations of Mr. Tajani, and we all insist that he must resign. He cannot continue for the rest of his term, and he cannot continue to be president, chair of the parliament from after the summer. When he assumed his duties, he said that he would seek equality among all MPs, and he would try to collaborate with all political groups. Then and now, we never collaborate with fascists. All political groups were avoiding them. He declared he would try to increase collaboration among everyone. His proposals and his approach actually highlights that he's a far-right politician, and it's dangerous to have this kind of speaker at the European Parliament. This is an issue that concerns all of us. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentations. Now, Europe for the many is not just a motto. This is part of European unity, European cohesion. It has to do with serving the needs of the many. I believe that politicians like you should try to give examples and more details about how this can work. In the past months, I was impressed by the fact that in 3 countries, well, in Greece, for example, it goes without saying that the Anofoti will bring meals for young children. In the UK, during the Brexit discussion, this is also talked about in the Parliament. And in the Czech Republic, we also talk about the same thing. So we're talking about proposals for school meals. And in the past, this was something that was taken for granted by citizens in these countries. So we must give specific examples when we talk about a Europe for the many and to explain what hides behind this motto. And another issue that has to do with many European countries, allowance policies, for example, or subsidy policies. A simple explanation for benefit policies is that they have to do with a deep sense of solidarity and of workers between them. So when someone becomes unemployed, society has to help this person to be able to regain his right to employment. Solidarity was very increased during the first years of the crisis, and I believe that in the left we should not abandon the struggle, but we should try to reinforce the links between trade unions, various solidarity groups. Solidarity is an important issue because, as the comrade said before, we must understand what Marx said. We organize things not as saviors of the society, but as equals. Thank you. One last comment, please. The gentleman there. And I can see that the ladies here want to answer many of your comments. My name is Kostas Broutsalis, teacher, researcher, author. I live outside the city of Tripoli. Both speakers gave very interesting approaches. Apart from social measures, social rights, personal rights, all fields and all sectors that can be used as a reference point for our society in Greece and in Europe are always useful. However, what the global left lacks today is the know-how, so that simple citizens may regain their hope. The left must act. So the global capital has cornered modern societies. And there are many people actually fighting for one job. The bargaining power of the average person, of the average worker, of an unprivileged person, has to do with demand. This situation, this globalization, has actually brought about a chaotic situation. We see that the global economic system has accumulated power in invisible hands. We are talking about the markets who are controlling everything, and they are actually creating high debts in all countries, and they are actually an invisible force. So it is a huge issue about how we can tame this power and we can channel it to another direction with respect to human beings. We see that this global system is problematic, and even Trump is actually making protectivist movements and protectivist moves in order to address this global situation, this globalization. There are issues that have to do with the evolution of societies themselves. I see that the Greek society has many problems. For example, as I told you, I live outside the city of Tripoli. So I see that there is a complete dismantling of agricultural production, primary production. The farmers are desperate. In the past, in areas where we had an active population who were producing and who were ensuring their livelihood, we are now seeing desert villages, people whose children have graduated from higher education and are trying to find their place in globalized societies. So global developments need to be analyzed deeply and in detail, and we are found at an impasse. So the far right is actually exploiting this situation and is trying to tame through violence this system that is functioning in an anarchist way. I don't have anything else to add. The question has to do with the Marxist theory. Philosophers explain the world, but what is important is how we can change the world and to have the technical knowledge, the know-how in order to change it, and not just talking about capitalism. Because many people in Greece talk about capitalism and are actually want others to do the job, the dirty job, and are actually talking only theoretically. I will conclude here. Of course, all measures to reinforce our impoverished society must be promoted at the European level. We must also coordinate European societies towards a progressive path, and we must find ways in order to adopt measures globally which will not allow countries to act as they want, arbitrarily, in a way that reminds us of the Middle Ages. And this could have an effect on global trade and global international relationships. Anneta, you have each of you has 1 minute.
Right, I'll only need a minute. In a nutshell, 3 points. Well, first of all, I couldn't agree more that the refugee issue must be the spear point of our speech and our arguments in view of the European elections, European Parliament elections. I think it's a one-way street, because the refugee issue promotes and highlights all these issues that have to do with the relationship with the far right and fascism and all that. No objections there. Now, as regards what said the comrade earlier, is that nothing goes without saying, okay? Now, for us, offering school meals is something that goes without saying. We need to do that because it's an act of solidarity. But you have seen how much this has been ridiculed as a measure. So it has to do with the viewpoint of the values, which viewpoint you adopt. It goes without saying that we will keep on doing that. We won't stop. There's no discussion, there's no argument about that. Unfortunately, the lady's comment is off the microphone. Now, it has to do with a viewpoint regarding values, and what is self-understood for us is not for the other. And the same goes for rights, okay? And one last thing. picking up from where Kostadina said about Tajani. This, you see, parliamentary cloak is a very dangerous one, and I'm saying this because, well, last evening in Parliament we had a similar event. You'll understand what I mean about similar. It's what happened when the Speaker of the House, Nikos Voutsis, was meeting with Nikole Dimitrov, which is the Foreign Minister of Northern Macedonia. At the same time, Kasidiaris is outside the Speaker's office by shouting, by being bravado and using a small lapel pin video camera to videotape this whole thing, to do all this bravado thing. And he was going in and he was shouting in Greek and in English that Macedonia is Greece, you're selling out Greece and Macedonia and you're traitors. Now, why I'm saying this, that we need to be even more strict. And we, who are members of parliament, must take more strict and austere measures. I said that yesterday, that Golden Dawn is not a political party. Kasidiaris is not one of us. Golden Dawn is a criminal organization. It must be treated as such, and this is something we must go out and say without fear, without passion, that Golden Dawn is not a political party. Full stop. Thank you. Now, thank you very much, all of you, for being here today in this very bright day, in this rather dark room. Now, it was very interesting, I must say. And anyway, this is what technology is all about, that the beautiful things that were said here can be heard again and used in the future. Have a good day, enjoy your stroll, and we'll see you here back early this evening.